Go for it.
So one thing I've learned here, you might tell by my accent, I'm Canadian, so sorry if I apologize unnecessarily. The one thing I've learned here is the British military say no cuff too tough, which is cool one, just wing it, but it's okay, I've got notes. So for context, yes, I am Canadian, I'm just over here in an exchange position, and I figured I'd take a chance to come to London for a free day. It's been great so far. I'm also in the military, so that means two things. Our primary role is to close with and destroy the enemy, but next to that, we're really, really good at acronyms. I've tried to minimize the acronyms. If they don't make sense, just throw something at me. I speak French, I speak English, I also drop into Army Lingish, and it's very vulgar. So if I slip into that, also please just throw something at me. I'll try not to do it. So I resisted the definition slide, but I'm going to talk about them anyways. So first thing first, mission assurance. That is, in military parlance anyways, that's your ability to tell your boss, the commander, that for your part of the mission, it's going to go ahead. You've got a contingency plan, you've thought of every possible reasonable thing that could come up with, and you got a plan for it. In my world, in the communications world, it's called a PACE plan. You got primary comms, alternate comms, contingency, and even emergency comms. So if you can do all that, you got mission assurance, you're good to go. You can go ahead with your mission. And then the other giant $100 words in there is closed proprietary systems. So for context to this presentation, a closed system is something that doesn't touch the internet or doesn't touch public networks. And proprietary, I guess in Britain, we'd call it bespoke. So it's something that you can't go down to PC World and buy. And then the last definition I'll hit, perhaps, is risk. So just be clear, when I'm going to talk about risk, I'm talking about not just a threat, but also a vulnerability. So in Army terms, if you're going to run across a field at a tank, that's very, very risky. But if you're just running across a field, that's not risky because there's no threat. And if there's just a tank with no one running at it, that's also not risky because there's no one to shoot at. So let's bust on. So almost 2 decades ago, I joined the Army, and we had the ANPRC 524, Army Navy Personal Radio Communications 524. Very formal. It's got large buttons. It's got large switches. It's got no buttons. It's just straight up hardware. It's a very rugged piece of kit. If it didn't break, you drop tested it to seat the cards back on the ground. And so what that meant is if comms weren't working, either the hardware was broken or this amazing thing we call a sudden ionospheric disturbance, which just means sometimes the atmosphere is wrong and the radios don't work well. As a radio operator, that will save you from getting a lot of shouting at. But Vietnam era technology, or if you're in Canada, 1999 technology because military procurement. And then we went on to the RT 5121 and the Army Navy Personal Radio Communications 117 Foxtrot. So those are acronyms, but these two radios here, they do a wider range of communications. They've got some software in them. You can tell because now there's buttons and not switches, right? But it's still mostly hardware. So if something breaks, it's probably the hardware. It might be a battery, so it might be some software stuff. And you've still got sudden ionospheric disturbance to save you if you broke something. And then when you stick it all together, you can have a couple infantry fighting vehicles, throw some canvas in between them, remote the radios. And when I say remote, it's not like a remote like this. It's literally just a long wire with a button that you push to talk on it. Very straightforward. But 1999 technology, 2001 technology, we're calling that a deployed network. However, because computers are a thing and everybody likes email, it does have most of the pieces that you would see in a typical office network, right? It's got a printer, it's got computers, it's got radios. They don't usually connect together and they never work well because of sudden ionospheric disturbance. Don't ever use that if email goes down. It's not believable. Also, as the radio technology, oh, that's 2 buttons. Go back. Honestly, I am in communications. I know how to work computers most of the time. Right. So instead of just 2 vehicles back together with a piece of canvas, let's add more of that because we like computers and we like having our email, right? Even though it's sweaty and dirty, we want email for some reason. So you put a whole bunch of vehicles together and you put a lot of tents in between there. And then you can have a whole bunch of computers and you can have all kinds of office stuff. But it's not networked very well. And what's the point of having computers if you can't network them? So in this typical setup here, this is, I don't remember the exercise, but it's not an actual deployment. We're just practicing there. And it's called a command post. So it's got everything, brigade commander, So infantry, maybe armored guy in charge, or girl, in charge of 5,000 to 6,000 troops, and they've got this command post, and everything's networked together. But if something goes wrong, because we're still talking about mission assurance, then it's probably software, or maybe it's hardware, or maybe it's power distribution, or maybe you didn't patch it, or maybe it's our friend's sudden ionospheric disturbance. But there's a lot of complex pieces in there, and it gets complex very, very quickly. So more about my personal story. When the button works. Then I went to Afghanistan, and I'm not telling Veterans Affairs my body hurts all the time, but most of my body hurts all the time. And I found out there's this amazing plan where in the Canadian Armed Forces, they'll send you to university for free. T's and C's may apply. And then you have job security for 7 years. That's the T and C's. You don't get to choose where you work. You're in the Army for 7 years. But it's great. So I switched over from being what we would call hard field Army, and then I went to school. And I learned about networks. So this is an abstracted network. We've got a cloud there. As a rule of thumb, if you're talking about InfoSec, always be worried when there's a cloud. But in this case, it's a public cloud, so we can email between bases, not just between tanks. You've got a router, you've got firewalls, DMZ, servers, laptops, all that kind of classic stuff, right? And there's an industry process for doing mission assurance on that, right? Like Jamie just talked about bug bounty. We know how to find vulnerabilities in that, and we know how to fix that mostly, or at least there's an industry around that. But then, while I was at school, they modernized our radios again. So if you're keeping track, that's twice in 20 years. That's pretty good. And now we have these things called a communication selector box. That's the one on the left. That's the one on the left. And that just chooses which radio you're talking on. And then you can also configure the radio through that. So you can change channels on a radio in somebody else's vehicle by turning this dial. And then we have a thing called a LAN Ethernet switch, which is just a switch with some really overpriced military hardware stuck onto it to make it ruggedized. So that's great. Now we've got a utopia of data sharing, right? So I've got laptops, I've got printers, I've got servers. It's all connected together. Trucks are talking. That's amazing, right? We want that. I think, maybe. But actually your network kind of looks like this. Pardon me. So on your left, you've got your typical office network. So when I'm working in the office, we're getting the computers ready to deploy it to the field. We're on an office network. And then there's this air gap, and then we're on a deployed network. And the deployed network's safe, right? Because no hackers can get onto that because it never touches the internet, right? It doesn't matter that USBs and CDs and DVDs or tape drives or whatever going back and forth. Right? I should see shaking of heads because, for one example, there was Stuxnet, right? So we've proven that nation-state actors, and if you're the military, you're worried about nation-state actors, we've proven that nation-state actors can jump air gaps. So now we have to figure out how to do that. So I really liked Jamie's talk. I thought it was amazing. I very much doubt the military is going to get them to bug bounty on their internal proprietary network with proprietary software and proprietary hardware. Also, the close with and destroy thing, we're very good at smashing things. Not all of us are very good at figuring out how to break computers on purpose and then fix it again. So that's the problem that I left university with. How do you fix that? Another network diagram, because network diagrams are great. So this is what two vehicles look together. So it doesn't matter if it's a command post, if it's two infantry fighting vehicles or tanks or fuel trucks. From a network point, it's all the same. That's pretty much what they look like. So you've got this dashed line across the middle. So top is one vehicle, bottom is another vehicle. You've got the communication selector boxes. You've got LAN Ethernet switches, headsets, radios, everything you would expect to see in a truck. That's what our network looks like now. So how do we fix that? How do we address this problem? So after I left university, I went to the Canadian Forces School of Communications and Electronics, and I was teaching some network defense and servers and routers. I wasn't doing most of the teaching. I just weighed in and jumped in there. So that's basically just SANS courses, but with more shouting and more running and heavy things to carry too. It's great. So in my spare time, at the same time I was doing grad studies on this problem, how can we fix it? And because I was at the communications school, we had a training lab to teach people how to operate this stuff, which means we've got all the equipment. It all works great because it's a training establishment. It has to work. You can't train people on broken kit. And it's not connected to any real network. So if it breaks accidentally, it's not a big problem. So I bought the Commandant a few beers and said, I've got a couple ideas. Can I play on this network and see what happens? Like as a starter for 10, what does rudimentary pen testing look like on proprietary hardware, proprietary software? So I read a lot of documentation Fortunately, I don't like my wife and kids very much. I was gone all evenings and weekends reading exciting military technical documents. And I kind of came up with this process, which is what we're talking about, mission assurance for closed proprietary systems. If you don't have bug bounties to rely on, if you can't really look at all the CVEs, you've got to do a holistic examination. That's really tiny from back there. I'm sorry. So step one, you do a system analysis. You read all the documentation. Then you do a vulnerability analysis. Where are the weak points? Where are the communications bottlenecks on this? And then how can I break them? So that's the exploit. So you look at the system, you find the weak points, you see if you can break it, and then you write a report, and that's really, really critical. So a lot of the times commanders will be told you've got 237 critical vulnerabilities in your network, sir. He's like, well, I had 230 last year, and my email still works, so it's not a problem, right? You need to write your exploits and your vulnerabilities in a way that shows them meaningfully. So I'd recommend, whether it's industry or in the military, pick your top one or two, say that's the critical one. Don't give 230 critical vulnerabilities. So I took the documentation, I took some ideas, I took a laptop with Kali on it, and I plugged it into a communications selector box, and I told it it was a headset, and it believed me. And then I opened up full packet capture, and then I threw in EtherCap, and a couple others, like low equity scripting tools. I am not a hacker. I can say Ode and I can maybe talk the talk, but I'm not a high-end hacker. But I did manage to break a bunch of stuff. I squiggled some of it out of it, so you can't see. I thought it'd be a little bit irresponsible to throw that up there. But I found a large number of sometimes complicated vulnerabilities, sometimes really simple vulnerabilities. If you're on an IP network, and that network is command and control for a combat team, you can choose when the commander gets to talk on the radio or not. That's a great thing if you're the person the commander is shooting at. It's really bad if you're on that commander's side. So that kind of stuff is what I found. I did proof of concepts. I had physical access to the system. The next step in further research would be to do it through a radio or some other kind of network access. But I haven't done that. I tricked him into sending me here instead, and it's great. I do like it being here. So I've renamed my presentation. It's not evaluating. It's maybe there is no such thing as mission assurance. We've got a problem, but we don't really know what the problem is. Remember the two parts to risk, right? We kind of know what the threat is, maybe sort of, but do we know what our vulnerabilities are? No, because no one's really looking at it. And I think that applies not just within the military, but within any enterprise that has proprietary systems that they're not letting external organizations have a look at. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thanks, Josh. Anyone have questions? Okay, anyone have concerns? Okay, I've got one. So when you said, how do you figure out what the problem is? You mean you didn't just Google it and see if it wasn't out on the web already? That was a joke. Sorry. I have a bad sense of humor. I'm from the U.S.
I'd like to go there.
Questions, all kidding aside. No questions. Comments, thoughts, ideas, suggestions? Ideas and suggestions. Always a good one.
The industry which we work in, we're both pen testers. We come from kind of national infrastructure type backgrounds with a lot of proprietary systems. So although it's not military, what you're talking about resonates with us quite a bit, actually. So yeah, no, it's really interesting. Enjoyed it.
Well, thanks. I'm glad it's relevant.
The guy from the college that doesn't exist in...
Hello. Yeah, I really enjoyed that talk. That was extremely fascinating. I'm just quite amazed that you're like the only person who's kind of looking into this. Like, is there no one else working with you or with that equipment that's like, maybe we should just check if this stuff is secure? Or
so, full disclosure, I started this work about 3 years ago. I wrote a master's thesis on it about a little over a year ago. So the ball is rolling. People are starting to look at it.
Right.
And when I talked to the designers, because that was part of the documentation, I went to the people who built it and designed it, and I said, what's your approach? And one of the things they said was, we're going to take public software and put it on this proprietary system, because that way we know it's been bug bountied and bug tested. That's great, right? How often are you updating it? So people are looking at it, just not enough, in my humble opinion.
Amazing. Thanks.
And here I thought the comment back would have been, I wasn't cleared high enough to get that information. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, with that, thank you very much, Josh.
Thanks very much.